Member for Markham Unionville.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je suis
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to speak to this bill. As you know, the Liberals will be voting against it for a number of reasons, but I'd like to begin with a point that I haven't heard in this debate. That's the fact that the government's a scaremongering government.
Proposing to fire some 20,000 public servants, but some 100,000 public servants have received notice that they might be fired. So the effect of that is to create a culture of fear in 100,000 Canadian families. And I think this is a mean-spirited and heartless way to carry out reductions in employment, causing fear in so many more people than will actually be affected. I mean, we are not strangers to expenditure review when we were government, but at no point did we arrange the loss of employment in such an unnecessarily cruel way. More often than not, we did it by attrition. Sometimes that was not possible, but we never sent notices to 5 times the number of people that could lose their job to the effect that they might lose their job. So I thought that was a particularly reprehensible part of this law. Second thing I don't like about it is that Canada depends on innovation for productivity growth. Canada's record on private sector expenditure on R&D has been weak compared with that of most other Western countries, and that's one of the reasons why our productivity growth has been low for many years, decades, and why the growth in living standards of the Canadian middle class has been suffering. So one would have thought that a sensible government might inject measures to promote innovation, to promote research and development expenditures. But what do? They do just the opposite. They reduce by a very significant amount the SR&ED tax credit. And the SR&ED tax credit is an extremely valuable tool to encourage research and development, innovation and productivity growth. And so for some inexplicable reasons, this has been cut. There was the proposal, and I don't think it's in the budget, but there was the proposal that instead of to give less in tax credits, but more in direct grants to companies. Now that's a very weird idea coming from a conservative government, because that implies the government has the wherewithal and the knowledge and the brains to distinguish between winning companies and losing companies. If you're a conservative, wouldn't it make more sense to use a tax credit which is neutral, which does not imply that government knows best, and let the market and the entrepreneurs decide which companies are winners and which companies are losers? So this approach taken by the Conservatives is kind of reminiscent of what one might expect from an NDP government, which might well think that governments knew best, but instead we have this rather paternalistic approach to how we should run this economy coming from the Conservative side of the House. So maybe that means we need to get back to the Liberals.
Hear, hear.
That's right.
I agree.
There are many other weaknesses of this bill. It dramatically weakens the laws on waterways and other things. But I'd like to spend a little time on why I think that it's a badly constructed bill. Whether you agree with all the content or not is one thing, but it's constructed in a sloppy way, which probably reflects the fact that when you try to have so many pages of legislation in so little time, you're likely to make mistakes. So let me just describe 3 of these mistakes, which leads me to think that this is not only a bad bill, it's also a very sloppy bill that will probably need further corrections down the road. The first point, which I mentioned earlier in a question, so I won't go on it in detail, is the hiring credit, where the government slips in a 7-cent EI premium hike, where in cases of companies that are near their limit, they will be penalized by either hiring more people or paying higher wages. So this is a complete slip-up, unless the government deliberately set out to hurt small businesses. This is something the government should not have wanted to do. It is an unintended negative consequence of this bill. And so that is why we brought in an amendment to fix it to committee, but the government declined to support our amendment. Donc ça c'est la première chose où
That's the first thing. The government made a mistake, and that's the first reason why I think this bill is ill-drafted.
bad thing about the construction of this bill refers to the negative impact on Canada's mining industry. And, you know, I don't always agree with the Conservatives, but I don't think they deliberately set out to destroy Canada's mining industry. So I would say this is another unintended consequence, because one of the items in the bill has a potentially serious negative effect on the mining industry. And to make this point, I want to quote from a letter from the Toronto Stock Exchange and TSX Venture Exchange dated November 14, 2012, which explains clearly the grounds of this concern. And the section of the bill concerns tax avoidance and specifically something called foreign affiliate dumping. And here is a direct quote. It's not a quote from the It's a quote from the Toronto Stock Exchange on why they claim that this bill is flawed. And I quote, "We believe that the proposed rules in their current form cast too wide a net and risk impacting or diminishing legitimate and entirely appropriate activity by hundreds of publicly listed companies on our markets. Should the rules be introduced without further appropriate amendment," and there were no amendments, should the rules be introduced without further appropriate amendment, Canada's world-leading position and reputation as a market for resource issuers may be negatively impacted by creating inefficiencies in accessing capital and harming corporate valuations. Based on our preliminary research, and this is still the TMX speaking, we estimate that in excess of 700 publicly traded Canadian corporations with operations in a foreign jurisdiction could potentially be inadvertently and inappropriately impacted by the proposed rules. We are extremely concerned that decades of effort to give Canada global leadership in a critical sector of capital markets activity can be impacted by the unadjusted implementation of the proposed rules." End of quote. So that's very clear language. This law will unintentionally harm some 700 publicly traded Canadian corporations in a sector of the economy, the mining sector, which is critical, has been in the past critical to Canada's prosperity and will continue to be critical to our prosperity going forward. And I'll read you one other quote on this same subject, a letter from the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada dated October 13, 2012. And I quote, "Given the substantial quantum of money required to bring a mining project into production, the proposed provisions will result in an unacceptable level of additional tax risk being added to the undertaking of the development of the project, making it less attractive for foreign investors to invest in such corporation residents in Canada, and consequently adoption of the foreign affiliate dumping proposals as currently drafted will make it extremely difficult for Canadian juniors to finance large projects." End of quote. So, you know, the Conservatives had these letters. They had their own financial analysts. Are they too proud? Is there too much hubris to admit that in all those hundreds of pages they might have made one or two slip-ups? There was ample time to fix it. We brought it to their attention, but they chose not to. They went blindly ahead with a project that was fundamentally flawed and that it will wreak serious damage onto one of Canada's key industries. So I can count at least 3 ways in which this bill is badly constructed. C'est un projet de loi qui est...
This bill is badly constructed, first of all, because of the credit, which I explained a few moments ago, and secondly, because of the mining industry, which I also just set out, and third, given that they made a lot of mistakes in their last bill, and those mistakes had to be fixed in this bill, I have no doubt that in the next few months or in the next year, we'll find mistakes in this bill. And once again, Parliament will be obliged to make changes to this bill.
I think my time is starting to run out, but
You're doing a good job.
let me just conclude by saying that I really, really reject this culture of fear when you send possible dismissal letters to 100,000 families when you only need to lay off 20,000 people. I think this is totally unnecessarily, totally mean-spirited, especially as we approach Christmas. And I think it is also entirely inappropriate for a country like Canada, which has suffered from low innovation and research and productivity, to slash the shred of tax credits. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I would contend that technically speaking, this is a badly constructed bill. It's a bill that could have been amended in simple ways to fix these fundamental deficiencies, but which the Conservatives, perhaps through hubris, perhaps through wanting to amend nothing whatsoever, refuse to even consider such amendments. And so as a consequence, we have flaws in the hiring credit legislation which will damage some small businesses in this country. We have flaws in the foreign affiliate dumping legislation that will do serious harm to Canada's mining industries. And given the flawed and sloppy nature of the drafting of this bill, given that errors were contained in the previous budget implementation bill, which had to be corrected this time around, you can be sure, Mr. Speaker, that the next time around, 6 months from now, 3 months from now, 1 year from now, we will see a new bill fixing the errors, perhaps those I've mentioned, perhaps many more, that will undoubtedly be contained in this bill. Thank you very much.
Good job.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Vegreville Wainwright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I listened carefully to the member's comments, and he would know, I think, that the funding to SHRED, which was a program that certainly many would argue had some value, but that funding has been much better focused through other programs so that innovators actually get more of the funding, and so that funding also is spread to a broader community, so taxpayers are getting good value for money spent on innovation. I think the member knows that. And as well, Mr. Speaker, I think the member really does understand that our budget implementation bill is a good bill. Just listening to him, he doesn't want to say it. He's a Liberal, but a lot of the undertones certainly indicated that. He recognizes a lot of what we're doing had to be done, and I'm sure he will back me up on this completely, Mr. Speaker, when he answers.
Honourable member for Markham Unionville.
The honourable member has a pretty strong nose if he could smell support for coming from me in those comments that I made. It's interesting that he is the one that should have made this point, because my answer is similar to a comment he made on what I said the other day, when I said he's a conservative. So why should these conservatives stand up in the House and talk about the government creating 80,000 or 800,000 jobs when it's the private sector? And he kind of acknowledged I was right. Today, I accuse this conservative government of behaving like NDPers, because instead of giving people tax credits, which are neutral, they shift to government choosing winners in transferring money directly from the government to individual companies. So I think, rather than me being a conservative, I think he's starting to behave like a Liberal.
Probablement, il y a le temps.
There's probably time for one question. The honourable member for Montmorency Charlevoix Haute-Côte Nord. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In this bill, you can see there's protection for navigable waters. Before, there was environmental protection to study the impact of any new construction. And sometimes there were studies, reviews, both provincially and federally, overlapping. Now that this work is no longer going to be done federally, it's automatically going to be up to the provinces. In cases where the provinces do that, some provinces don't even do those reviews. I'd like the member to explain, why did the federal government decide, why did the Conservatives decide to transfer these responsibilities and costs to the provinces? The Honourable Member for Markham Unionville. In general, this government has a very positive attitude toward provincial jurisdiction. It's hardly surprising that they would give more responsibilities to the provinces. I'm not against a more effective environmental assessment process, and there's no need for overlap, but I don't want less regulation. I want more effective regulation, but not less rigorous. And for the Conservatives, I think they're really looking for softer regulation, less regulation, and that might be another reason why we're opposed to this bill.
Comme il est 17h15.
It being 5:15.